And I want to share with you today about the Sabbath. We're back to those pillar doctrines. We covered 3 of them and we're moving on. Many people hear the name Roger Williams, the man who established Rhode Island. What many people don't know that he was expelled by the Puritan leaders from Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that forced him to move elsewhere. This land that was supposed to be giving liberty of conscience and faith was still expelling people. When you look at the basic history, for example, Maryland was established by Catholics, and that's why the name is what? Maryland. And so as Roger Williams established his Providence plantation, he promised liberty of conscience, making Rhode Island the first government in the Western world to guarantee religious freedom in its founding chapter. But even in his church of Roger Williams, the liberty of conscience meant liberty to believe and practice according to the established dogmas and doctrines. And don't you dare believe something different. At the same time, across the pond in England, among the Baptists, there was a new doctrine emerging. James Oakford wrote this book titled The Doctrine of the Fourth Commandment, deformed by popery, reformed and restored to its primitive purity. It was published in London in 1650. We do not have a picture of James Oakford, but we have a picture drawing of his not only contemporary but closest friend. They were part of the small group, and the one pictured here is Dr. Peter Chamberlain, who was a personal physician to kings of England. James the First, King James Bible fame, Charles the First, and Charles the Second. They're early Sabbatarian Baptists. He was graduate of Emmanuel College, Cambridge. And it's Seventh-day Baptists that were returning to the biblical practice of honoring God as creator on the 7th day of the week, the Sabbath. And as they worked to convince others, there are a number of believers in London. One of them was a man by name Stephen Mumford. We do not have any drawings because these people did not think back in the day that they would become celebrities and famous and important people. All we have is his gravestone. He moved to the Rhode Island and became a member of the Bell Lane Baptist Church in there. The challenge is this: it was not well accepted, so his wife and 7 other people, this small group, I'm emphasizing a small group, it would take them 7 years to establish the first little church. It's the first Seventh-day Baptist Church in Newport. It would take them 130 years from organizing this first church to become a movement, to become an organization. It would be in 1802, literally almost 130 years later, that there were 50 churches, about 60 ministers, and 5,000 of Seventh-day Baptist believers. And one of them was this young lady by name Rachel Oakes Preston. She moved with her daughter, who was a teacher, to a town called Washington, New Hampshire. And as there was no Seventh-day Baptist church, she attended the local Methodist church. You want to guess what day? Sunday, because that's when Methodists worship. So even though she was the Seventh-day Baptist, but she went to church on Sunday because she wanted to worship with fellow Christians. And there, she approached their pastor, Frederick Wheeler, who was preaching at the communion service just like we do today. He was the Methodist circuit rider, and he would do communion every 3 months. And it was a communion Sabbath Sunday that he was preaching the sermon. And she respectfully participated in the communion, and then after the service approached him and called him out on his hypocrisy. She said to him, "You're preaching about keeping the commandments, but you yourself are not keeping all the commandments." And he was surprised and inquired which one. So she said, "Well, the number 4. Remember the Sabbath to keep it holy." And so as Pastor Wheeler listened to this Seventh-day Baptist lady, he began to keep the 4th commandment. He was the first Adventist to observe the Sabbath, and she was the first Sabbath keeper to become an Adventist. Do you get the point? This is the picture of that church. And as you see, it's a Methodist church, used to be, but it became Adventist and eventually would become a Seventh-day Adventist. And you could see that cemetery where many of these pioneers are buried, including Rachel Oakes. We're blessed as a family to travel there in 2012. It's one of my not just hobbies, but I love to take the family on vacation back to those places of pioneers. And Sammy was the youngest, was probably pointing out that they waited for Jesus to come. But I tell you, it was a memorable place to stand on that hallowed ground. It is listed as the birthplace of Seventh-day Adventist Church because the first Seventh-day Adventist Church was built there. But besides this, friends, we're coming to emphasize that the 4th doctrine in our church became the Sabbath. See, our movement was organized on expecting Jesus to come. We understood that when people die, they rest until the resurrection. We understood that it's important to understand the sanctuary if we are to decipher the Bible, if we are to understand the message in the Bible. And the 4th doctrine that would embrace as the movement, this discovery, was the doctrine of the Sabbath. Now, it was a journey. The next person in line is Thomas Preble. He was the second Millerite Adventist minister to accept and preach the Seventh-day Sabbath, and he produced a tract and published it in the Millerite Adventist magazine, Hope of Israel, in March of 1845. Now, of interest is that he was the first, friends, not only to publish the tract, but to point out to something interesting. Pay attention, it was this man, Thomas Preble, who said that the little horn of Daniel would change the laws and the time. He connected Daniel 7:25 with the doctrine of the Sabbath, pointing out that the church has changed the Sabbath to Sunday. Preble quoted Miller and wrote that all children of God are the true Israel. And if the Sabbath was given as the sign forever, then it is a perpetual covenant. It was Preble who pointed out that it was Jesus' practice to go to the synagogue what day? The Sabbath. It was Preble who pointed out that Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It was Preble who pointed out that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath, and therefore, which day is the Lord's day? Hello? It's in the Bible. And so it was this Methodist minister, Thomas Preble, who became a Seventh-day Adventist before such a thing even existed, that was pointing out. He was a Bible student, and as he read his Bible, he said, look at this. Jesus was thinking about the Sabbath, speaking into the future. He said to his followers, pray that when persecution comes, that when Jerusalem would be destroyed, your flight would not happen when? On the Sabbath. And so he was pointing out that the Sabbath is not redundant, that Sabbath is relevant. It was Thomas Preble in that tract who was pointing out that Apostle Paul would go in the pagan cities, in the Greek cities, to the synagogue on what day? The Sabbath. And as he read there in the book of Acts, he said, count, Apostle Paul went at least 78 times to the synagogue in Corinth. Why? Because he was there for a year and a half, and it says every Sabbath. And not only Jews, but the Gentiles, the Greeks, would come and say, teach us on what day? The Sabbath. You see, I'm putting these passages because you're familiar with them. He persuaded both Jews and the Greeks of the gospel. And so it was the work of Thomas Preble to communicate that if you read the New Testament, there's one day that stands out as a day of worship, and that's the Sabbath. Another Adventist who decided to travel and visit Wheeler was Joseph Bates. He read Preble. He learned that Wheeler was already keeping Sabbath, and so he went to see Wheeler, and as he visited Wheeler, he met the guys who were studying the sanctuary, Crozier, Hahn, and Edson. And so Joseph Bates would become now the Adventist who accept the sanctuary and the Sabbath, and those guys would also accept the Sabbath. Bates would become the first now to connect the Sabbath to the three angels message. Do you see how it's developing? Different people studying the Bible. Bates would say if Sabbath is about worshiping Creator, then notice this, the book of Revelation, the first angel says what? Worship God who created. The hour of judgment has come, and therefore you must worship Him who made heaven and the earth. Sabbath is about commemorating Creator. Because God in 6 days made heaven and the earth and rested on seventh. Friends, it would be Joseph Bates who would communicate for the first time this eschatological importance, because he was big into, you want to guess what book? Revelation. And so as Joseph Bates studied it, he pointed out, look at this. The dragon was wroth with the remnant of the woman who do what? Keep the commandments. It says before the end times there will be people who will keep the commandments, including the seventh commandment. He was the first to point out that after the three angels' message, the next thing you read is this, that here are those who what? Keep the commandments of God. Do you see the connection? It would be Joseph Bates who would draw our attention also to the possibility that opposing God's commandment may be accepting the mark of the beast. Now I'm going somewhere with this, because there would be a young couple, newly married, who read Bates' tract about the Sabbath, and they accepted the Sabbath. We didn't have the real picture. AI tried the best, but still it's AI. This is the real picture of that couple, but taken 10 years later, when they're not as young anymore. And you could recognize who they are, right? James and Ellen. In fact, Ellen suffered persecution in her own family. They're a newly married couple, and she was expecting a baby. And they lived with her parents because they couldn't afford a separate apartments or a house. But her mom and dad were Methodist, Adventist, who kept what day? Sunday. And they were not happy with their daughter and son buying into this new teaching of the Sabbath, and they had to go. They had to leave home and live with Stocklands to Stockland, Holland, I think was his name, and his wife, who gave them home because they also believed in the Sabbath. And so it's through this era, early Adventists would come together and study the Bible. They would call this Sabbath conferences, and they would call themselves Friends of the Sabbath. Now, friends, how many Friends of the Sabbath do we have today in house? Everybody, right? Why? Because we're here on what day? The Sabbath. So these folks call themselves Friends of the Sabbath. Now, those conferences were not held in some big convention centers. They were held, guess where? In barns, because in those days, houses were small. You drive in the county and you see the old houses. They're tiny. The largest house on someone's property, the largest building would be what? Not even a barn, it's a horse carriage. The ancient form of the garage. On that trip that we made with the kids, we're standing here beside David Arnold's barn, where one of those Sabbath conferences was held, and that's 13 years ago. It was already leaning. By now, probably it's all fallen and collapsed. But it was literally in these barns that believers would come together and dig deep and study. They call it the gathering time for future Seventh-day Adventists. So when the first issue of publication came out, The Present Truth, the first volume, the first issue, do you want to guess what the subject was all about? The Sabbath. That was the present truth of the day back then. Did they agree on it immediately? No. In 1853, James White would write, Adventists hold different views on many subjects, but the Sabbath becomes a mighty platform on which all stand united. And friends, it's during this time that one passage that they also embrace that is very important. I want you to open your Bibles to Hebrews chapter 4, verse 9. Just look it up. I'm not going to preach on this, because if we preach everything there's to say about the Sabbath, we would have to hold probably 2 years of Sabbath conferences, okay? But they pointed out to this passage, Hebrews 4:9, for the people of God, the Sabbath still remains. So if you want to ask me in the New Testament a passage about Sabbath, well, that's my first go-to passage, Hebrews 4:9. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And when you study that passage, it's not about vacation or sleeping. It's about celebrating Sabbath the way God expects that we worship Him as a creator. Review and Herald would republish many Seventh-day Baptist articles in the 1850s, and there would be a Seventh-day Baptist who would come and join our church. And he would come as an early missionary right here to Ontario. At that time, we were not worshiping the Sabbath the way we worship today, and I tell you why. This first early missionary was Rossville Fennell Cottrell. And at that time, Seventh-day Adventists were keeping the Sabbath from 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. Some were arguing we should keep it from morning to morning. Some were arguing that we should do the secular style from midnight to midnight. And it would be in these Bible conferences that they say, look, the Bible says from sunset to sunset, celebrate the Sabbath. From sunset to sunset is the day. When the days counted, says there was evening and there was morning. So friends, we did not come upon this doctrine by someone just making a declaration. It was a process. It was a journey of discovering from sunset to sunset. Literally, it was in 1855 that our practice of Sabbath would commence with Sunday. What's interesting that through all this time, nobody thought of consulting the Jews, even though there are Jewish communities all around them. But it's that attitude, we're going to figure it out ourselves. And God is patient, says, okay, I'll give you time, even if it takes you a decade. But eventually they figured out. But that was only beginning of learning, and here's why. Once we start sending missionaries, we discovered that people around the world already kept Sabbath. We're not bringing something new to them. There's a powerful book written by Charles Bradford, and I'm putting these pictures that you would understand the significance. You recognize the guy on the left, right? The guy on the right is Charles Bradford, who would write this book, Sabbath Roots. Sabbath Roots, the African Connection. Because what missionaries discovered, many tribes and places in Africa kept the Sabbath uninterrupted. For example, Akan people in Ghana, before Portuguese arrived there, they kept the Sabbath on the seventh day. They had a special honor for what they say, Onyame Kwame. In fact, they call Sunday white men's Sabbath. Do you understand that? In Ethiopia, there are tons of evidence. For example, Ethiopian Emperor Galawdevos, in dialogue with Portuguese for military support, stated to the Western church leaders that they keep the Sabbath in honor of God who rested and finished creation. Friends, if I were to have time, I would go on and on, because there's traces of Sabbath worship of Creator in Asia, in China, Nestorian connection of Christians, even in Russia, in Novgorod Republic, before it was conquered by Russian rulers, in India, in Armenia. Here's a little historical detail. In Scandinavia, in 1435, the church, Catholic Church at the time, had to call a special council to put an end to Saturday observance of Sabbath. And the king that would come years later, King Gustavus I Vasa, would call a special meeting in 1554 and issue an edict to stop the Seventh-day Sabbath. I see my notes are not in accordance with some slides, so that's all right. I'll skip to this. English traveler Purchas writes in his pilgrimages that the Greek Church of Constantinople, back then, forbade to fast except Easter Eve on Sabbath. They still recognize importance of the Sabbath. Friends, Sabbath has always been there. It's not something that we've invented as an afterthought. Now, you may wonder what this has to do. In London, England, there was a place which was called Paris Court, and they would stage blood sports there. Part of that blood sports was bears fighting dogs. And not to let your imagination run wild, there was a preacher who got up and predicted, he preached that judgment would fall on those who break the Sabbath, and he singled out Paris Garden. And where they did that bear baiting, one Sabbath, during the combat between the bear and the dogs, the upper gallery collapsed. 7 people died, many were injured, and so the whole nation said, you see what happens when you break the Sabbath? Unfortunately, their Sabbath was Sunday Sabbath. And so that group established strict rules, and they're called Puritans. Have you heard of Puritans? Part of the Puritan rule was anything that has fun is not allowed on Sabbath. Now, follow my thought here. King James did not like that. But you understand where the attitude, if you withhold thy hand and thy foot on Sabbath from doing what? Your pleasure. You see where that doctrine emerges from Isaiah 58 now? And so King James did not like that at all. And so he issued a book of sports. This painting by John Dolman represents the Sabbath breakers. And you see they're Puritans walking in the field inspecting the Sabbath breakers, those who go out there to play golf. But again, remember, their Sabbath was when? On Sunday. So they established very tight regulations, what was permitted to be done on Sabbath Sunday. And to object to that, King James, friends, the same King James, whose Bible so many people adore and admire, he published what's known as the Book of Sports. That book was reissued by King Charles first, and it listed permissible activities on Sunday Sabbath. I'm not diving into details, but the clash became so strong that it would lead to literally civil war in England between the Puritans and the Royalists. The book was seen as undermining the biblical Sabbath observance, even though it was Sunday. So when early Adventists learned about Sabbath from Baptists, guess where they got their ideas from? From the Puritans. So their version of how Sabbath must be kept came from who? Puritans. And therefore the attitude, no fun on Sabbath, came from Puritans. Some of us grew up in a Puritan version of Sabbath. Deny yourself all fun, And because of that, Sabbath became burden for many. As a pastor, I met families who were for generations Adventist. And I heard horror stories of why they left the church. Because they were supposed to dress in Sabbath garments, and they're not allowed to take it off until when? Until sunset. Don't you dare switch from your church suit into jeans in the afternoon. Don't you dare go out for a walk in the nature. Who did we get these ideas from? I want you to be clear, from Puritans, because we learned that from that Seventh-day Baptist. And over time, just like Pharisees, Sabbath became a burden to bear. We emphasize, observe the Sabbath, keep the Sabbath. This is the commandment. Now, is it true that it's a commandment? Yes. But should it be a burden to bear? Jesus said what? The Sabbath was made for your benefit. Now, you probably heard this story, and I repeat this story time and again because for me, it's something I would never forget. I was at the seminary from 2002 through 2004. And at that time, there were two prominent professors who would teach us students different Jewish rituals and so on. One of them was Richard Davidson. And so they organized a special Sabbath where they invited a rabbi from South Bend to spend the Sabbath with us Adventists on campus. And it was awesome. It was a great experience. And then at the end of the day, there was a panel discussion. And Dr. Davidson, with a smile and pleasure, asked the rabbi, so what do you think, Rabbi? How do we Adventists keep the Sabbath? Don't we have a lot in common? And the rabbi looks at him, says, well, there's a difference. You Adventists keep the Sabbath. We Jews, you want to finish the sentence? Celebrate the Sabbath, friends. There's a difference between attitude of keeping the Sabbath as a commandment and burden to impress God and understanding that Sabbath was given to us by God that we may truly understand and celebrate it as a blessing. You see, in 1951, a Jewish author, Abraham Heschel, written a book, The Sabbath, Its Meaning for Modern Man. And that book is celebrated because he outlines that Sabbath was given to humanity as palace in time. Like it or not, it comes. And it's up to you to invite God's invitation to celebrate the Sabbath. In 1970s, many of you remember this man, Sam Bakioki. He graduated from Rome, Pontifical University in Rome, and he's written that book, From Sabbath to Sunday. And he did the historical research to show that as early as the end of the first century, there's already Sunday observance creeping into the Christian church because of anti-Semitism, because Romans hated the Jews and they tried to bring some of those practices. So he was showing that long before Constantine, there's already Sunday observance in the church. But friends, the battle has been ongoing all the time. One historic thing that I must share was that when Martin Luther started Reformation, one of the Catholic bishops who was sent to argue with him was Eck. And Eck pointed out to Martin Luther that he himself was not keeping sola scriptura. Because if he were faithful to the Bible, then he should worship on what day? The Sabbath. And so Eck pointed Martin Luther, the great reformer, that he himself is being a hypocrite, and Luther lost that debate. Let's be honest about these things, friends. Here in the 19th century, in North America, as the Catholic Church was establishing itself, Catholic bishops and cardinals were emphasizing the fact that Sunday observance belongs to the church that established it. They were pointing out to the Protestants that as long as you keep Sunday, you may call yourself a Protestant, but guess what? You accept our church power and authority because we have changed the Sabbath observance from Saturday, seventh day, to Sunday. And so our church, in response, always emphasized the Sabbath as the sign of obedience to God. as a seal of God's approval and perpetual sign of allegiance. Remember our pioneers? They would call the Sabbath a perpetual sign for all times. Friends, we understand that we're sealed by the Holy Spirit, and that seal is our relationship with God. But the law of God has a Sabbath as that visible signet, the ring of God's authority, visible outward loyalty to God's law. Friends, you've been to many evangelistic series and you remember this emphasis, right? The Sabbath is what? The seal of God. One of our pioneers penned these words in the book Patriarchs and Prophets. The fourth commandment is the only one of all 10 in which we can find both the name and the title of the lawgiver. It is the only one that shows by whose authority the law is given. Thus, it contains the seal of God, affixed to his law as evidence of its authenticity and binding force. Just like the seal of President of US or seal of city mayor has his name and his title and the territory on which his authority is established, so is the Sabbath, the fourth commandment, calls God who created the universe, and he is the king and authority here. Friends, today, even more, when the evolutionary theory has been pumped in our schools for almost a century, we need the Sabbath as a reminder that God has created this world, friends. In fact, there's been an evangelical author who blessed the Seventh-day Adventist, Mark Knoll, for our Sabbath and belief in creationism as the final chapter of embarrassment to evangelicals. Because see, if we just let go of the Sabbath and stop talking about this God created, then the rest of Christianity would be free, finally, to accept the evolution. Hello? As long as I live, and I hope as long as you live, we're going to be faithful to this book. I believe that God has created miraculously in 6 continuous, contiguous days this world. Because if he didn't, if he had to wait for thousands of years or millions of years for this world to come to be, then how could I believe that one day he's going to come, melt down this planet, and create it brand new for us? Do you get my point? Our name, Seventh-day Adventist, stands for this. We believe that God created in 6 and rested on 7th. And we believe that when he comes, his second advent, he's going to recreate this planet anew. And that's why Sabbath is so important for us, because it points out to God's creative power. The same God who created, the same God is coming back to recreate it. Friends, I could preach on this for hours. Theologian Karl Barth pointed out that if you study the Bible, every time it talks about the judgment, it talks about the day of the Lord. And in Isaiah 58, the chapter that talks about the day of the Lord, it talks about 2 things: the judgment and the Sabbath. So friends, the Sabbath day points out on creation, and it also points to the judgment that is to come, friends. The Sabbath for us also reminder of that time when our parents, Adam and Eve, on Sabbath had a worship in a different setting. Friends, when you come to worship on Sabbath, you should remember that Adam and Eve worshipped on their first Sabbath where? In the garden, walking in the cool with God himself in worship. And so, friends, for us, Sabbath is a reminder that one day we'll worship with God again on Sabbath. But there's more to it, friends. This is one of the commandments that starts with what words? Remember. And today we're coming to another ordinance that is called what? Remembrance. Jesus, when he left, says, as long as you drink the bread and wine, remember. When he instituted this supper, he invited us to remember. As often as you do eat bread and drink this cup, do what? Remember. And so, friends, today we remember the Sabbath, we remember our Creator, and we remember Jesus who said, this is your ticket. This is a reminder to you that you're invited to that wedding supper when He comes. So, friends, today I invite you simply, remember the eternal rest, remember the fellowship of that garden, and remember who is your Lord today. Friends, let's celebrate this Sabbath.